Welcome to another Symmetry tutorial. This week we're doing environment design, and this will be my first environment design tutorial on the channel, so we're going to be starting just from the basics, not getting too crazy or anything like that. But I just want to show you that environment design is actually a little easier than most people think if you just break it down into sections and work in a workflow that makes it simpler. For good environment designs, a lot of people will tell you that adding more layers, just like the natural world, and more animation and more organic movement in your environments, the better and the more realistic it'll end up looking. But I have the idea that we can start from the beginning and just get the basic format of an environment down with this tutorial. And then in future environment tutorials, I'll be adding in more levels of detail and more animation. That way we can start from a foundation and work up. Make sure to like and subscribe down below. It really helps the channel out. And without further ado, let's get into this tutorial. And to make this environment today, I'm going to be only using minimal add-ons. I'll only be using BlenderKit. And I'll be using the A.N.T landscape add-on, which you can go to your add-ons. It's already included in Blender, and type in A.N.T landscape, this one right here, and make sure it's activated. And when you're making an environment design, it's very important to collect many references of similar scenes and landscape photography, and make sure that it's at high quality. That way you can see as many details as possible, and that way you can try and replicate those details too. So when I was researching my reference images, I was really liking these images with the lake as the foreground. And I think we can make a pretty cool cinematic animation of the camera going over the lake and then up to the mountains. Sometimes when you're wanting to make an environment too, it can seem very overwhelming and that there's a lot to do. But you can simply break down environment scenes into layers and sections, just like a normal photograph, where there's a foreground, midground, and background. So instead of feeling like you have to make this humongous immersive world just to get one shot for an animation, you can actually break down your shot into layers and be able to save rendering power too. So to start, we're going to tackle the foreground and start with our lake and the lake floor. And this week I'll be going over particle systems. I'll be going over how to blend textures so we can get these different rock textures and shaders blended just like this mountain, and that way we can get forest ground and some grass mixed too. We will go over some camera animations and how to make a cinematic landscape animation. So that's enough waiting, let's get started. And just like so many Blender tutorials, you already know what we're about to do. Press A and delete all. And then to create our lake floor, let's go ahead and add in a plane and scale it up 10. Let's bring up our end menu to see our dimensions. I'm going to scale it up more here. And when making environments, you'll start seeing this clipping here. And to fix that, just go to your View tab, and at the end, let's go ahead and add just a couple zeros, so it's 100,000. And we'll have to do that in our camera view too, once we add in a camera. So now I have my plane at about 1,000 meters on each side. Now with the plane added in, let's go into edit mode and add in a subdivision. I just want one cut, and then let's grab the outer edge here. And in loop tools, let's hit circle. Back into object mode, add a subdivision modifier, and let's make it 5. We can apply that modifier. Now we could have just made a circle or leave it as a plane, but doing this method, it'll give us the arch look as a landscape and give us curvature to the globe. Now with this made, we can label it lake floor .001, and then let's duplicate that and make this lake water .001. And we can hide the water one for now. And on our lake floor plane, let's add in a displace modifier in deform, displace. Let's do a new texture Then over here in textures, switch it from image to clouds. This is way too harsh. So let's bring our scale up a bit. I'm now realizing we're going to need to scale this up a little more to about 5,000. Let's add in one more subdivision to our lake floor. Bring that above our displacement. We can apply that modifier. And now with this many vertices, we can manually edit the topology. So we can apply this displace modifier, make sure it's shade smooth, and go into sculpt mode. Or you can go into edit mode with proportional editing on. Now with our lake floor and our lake water planes in here, we can add in our camera, because it's better to add in a camera earlier than later and adjust accordingly to where your scene shot is. So let's just bring the camera up, reset the rotation, RX90, and let's bring it all the way over here. And in the camera you might not see anything, and that's due to the clipping here too. So here let's just add in 2 more zeros like we did for the viewport, and the camera's backward. So let's bring the camera down too and rotate on the Z 180. And what I like to do is bring up a second screen here, and then that way you can edit the camera in one window and be able to see what the camera's view is in the other. So what I want to do is bring this camera into the middle more, because really we're going to focus on this half of the circle as far as particle systems and animation goes, just because it'll save render time and save your computer a whole lot of stress if we don't cover the entire thing with particle systems and weight maps. And then to help with animation later, we can parent a empty to our camera. That way when we animate the camera, there's a lot smoother turns and rotations to the camera. So with Shift S, we can move our cursor to selection and add in an empty, plane accesses, and then Command C, copy object location and copy rotation. Select the camera and then select the empty, and let's parent to the empty. So now we should be able to move the camera while we move the empty around. And with that done, we can start on our first particle systems. So hide our lake water, and with our lake floor selected, we can go into weight paint mode and create a new vertex group. Let's label this one rocks, and then let's make one for the grass that grows in the lake. So with our rocks selected, let's add in some jitter. And when you're doing particle systems in an environment, try to only focus on what is in the camera view, because you wouldn't need to add particles up here when it's not even going to be in the camera. You're wasting render power and your computer's going to hate you for it. So play around adding in weights, taking them out, trying to get a good balance of not too many rocks because it's going to be under the water. But the main one I want to focus on is the grass, because that will come up. Okay. Always make sure you have your correct ones selected. So this one's going to be our lake grass now. So in that case, let's go ahead, just have that. I wanted to add some like in the middle of the lake, and there's always some around the edge too. I think that'll look good for the lake grass. And you can always edit and play around with it later too. Let's go back into object mode. And now we have our weight map set up. So in the lake now we can apply our scale and go into edit mode. Face select. With all faces selected, let's unwrap it. Might take a minute just because of how big these planes are. And then same with our water. Let's apply scale. And in edit mode, all faces selected, unwrap again. Now with the lake plane done, we can go ahead and scour BlenderKit and Ambient CG for different textures that we might use for the lake floor. I used Ambient CG. I will put the link in the description for this website. And we can pull up this window and switch it to the shader editor. Do material preview and add a new material. And with the principal BSDF select, we can do Control-Shift-T to load in a texture. And then you want to grab the color, the displacement, one of the normals, and a roughness. Let's increase the scale of this texture to 10, and we can duplicate the principal BSDF, and then let's group all of this together with Control J, and let's name our node Lake Floor 01. And then let's load in another ground texture to mix in with this one. Let's group this one together and name it Lake Floor 2. And let's mix the shaders with Control Shift and right clicking. Now we can add in a more realistic mixture of these textures. So let's add in a noise texture and Control T to map it, and let's add in a color ramp. And then holding Control Shift and right clicking, you can preview different nodes in our texture. So we can bump up the contrast to see what we're working with here. Now with our noise texture edited, we can plug it into our mix shader here, into the factor, and then Control Shift and right click on our mix shader. And we can preview in the camera too, and that's looking pretty good. With the lake floor done now, we can add in some grass models and play around with our particle system. So let's head into BlenderKit and search grass. Let's filter it to be our free version. I do like this high grass clump and then these two wild grass patches here. Let's load in the grass clumps. And we can move these out of the way because we just need the particle system to reference it. Now let's just create a new collection within our scene to have all of our grass collections in one section. Now we can add in our first particle system. So in the particles menu, let's add in a new particle system. Let's make it a hair emitter. Check our advanced setting. In the render, let's just switch render as to a collection and have it reference the grass collection. Use object rotation, pick random. And then on the vertex groups for density, let's just set it to lake grass. And you might need to increase the scale of your particles so that you can see them. Check the rotation and switch our orientation to object Z or object Y, I believe. Yeah, object Y. And in the particle system, let's add some children. Interpolated. And 10 children for every particle should be enough. And when you need to edit meshes that have particle systems, it's always a good idea to turn off the viewport of the particle system and make your edits that way. Now that we have our grass laid out in our particle system and the texture on our lake floor, we can go ahead and make our water texture now. Let's add a new texture. And then first thing we're going to need to do is give more geometry to this water plane so we can add volume to it. So with all faces selected, we just need to extrude on the Z to give it volume. And then for a more cinematic view, we can change our resolution to 2560 by 1080. It gives it more of a widescreen look. And we can change the focal length to 25. Let's change the color to a dark blue. Let's bring the metallic up all the way. Roughness down. IOR of water is 1.33. Let's make this metallic a 0.95. Let's change our HDRI to the sunset. Let's make our background transparent. Now let's add in a bump node to the normal to add in some ripples. And let's add in a Fresnel node to the alpha. And switch the IOR back to 1.33. Now to add in the ripples, let's add in a noise texture to the bump node and plug that into the height, and let's scale it up to 1000. Let's switch it to 4D, that way we can animate later. And let's bump up the detail to 8. Now let's add in an ambient inclusion node. Bump up the distance to 1000. Let's add in a color ramp, plug in the AO to the factor, and then let's add in a curves node. Plug the color into the color. Let's increase the contrast on this color ramp, and in the contrast of the curves, let's bring this point down to about halfway in this last quadrant right there. And then let's plug this color into the strength of the bump node. Now let's add some volume to our water. So add in a principal volume shader, and let's add in a volume absorption shader. And then we can mix these two shaders. And then let's just change the volume absorption density to 0.5. And we can make these colors here a little more like a lake. And let's copy this color and put it into our emission color. Let's bump our factor up to a 0.8 and then just plug this into our volume. And now let's switch our render engine to cycles and switch it to GPU if you have one. And let's bring our samples down. We can make our viewport samples 300 and our render samples 512. And now we got a realistic lake that we can work with. Now it's time to add in our midground. But this would also be a good time to start preparing for when we render and breaking up our scene into sections. So I'm going to make the collection for the foreground, and then I will start on the midground. Now let's get this midground started using the A.N.T landscape add-on. And again, just make sure it is activated in your preferences, A.N.T landscape. We can hide our water. Now if we shift A and mesh, here at the bottom is landscape. And don't click on anything yet, pull up this menu, and this is the A.N.T landscape menu. So with the A.N.T landscape add-on, there's a lot of different presets here that you could play around with. And there's a lot of different settings that adjust the landscape that you're creating. I'll play around with this add-on for a little bit to get our midground hill. I'm going to be going for something a little shorter on this side that drops down and then goes up to like a bigger hill or a bigger mountain. I'll speed up the experimenting process and then I'll go over all my settings before I move on. these are the settings that I ended up with. I think this will make for a good mid-ground land piece, and we can edit it in sculpt mode too. So my land piece is 256 subdivisions. The mesh size is 7 by 4. The random seed I used is 15. I adjusted the offset to 0.89 and adjusted the height to a 0.69. And now we can scale this up and place it in the midground. Now that we have it scaled up in place, let's hop into edit mode, and with face select all faces, convert tris to quads, let's make sure scale is applied, and then let's unwrap. Now we can edit this landform to match our reference a little more, make sure proportional editing is on, and just move little by little, and then we can always hide the edges of our land piece too. And I think that's looking pretty good and matches our reference pretty well. And now to make mixing our textures a little easier, we can use our weight from slope. So go to the create menu here and weight from slope. And we want the Z slope. We can use this weight map to mix our different textures for this land piece. And now we can repeat what we did with the lake floor, but just on our mid-ground hill here, and mix in some textures, bring them in from Ambient CG or BlenderKit, whichever one you want. Pick textures and shaders that are going to go well with your color scheme of the scene. And then we'll get into how to mix these ones too. Let's bring up our shader editor and we can go into material preview again. And with our midground selected, let's do a new material, name it midground hill. And with the principal BSDF again, Control Shift T, and let's bring in our first texture for this hill. And to stay organized, let's make sure we group that texture together, Command J or Control J, and label it Ground 1. And we can add in another principal BSDF, again Control Shift T, and let's bring in our second ground texture. Group that one right away too, and let's mix these two shaders together now. Now let's adjust the scale of these textures here. Now similarly, we're going to mix it like the lake floor. So let's add in a noise texture and map it with Control T. And then let's bring in a color ramp. And now let's duplicate the color ramp, bring it up here, and let's preview our noise texture here. Bump up the contrast. Let's increase the scale to 10. And then let's adjust the scale here on the mapping too. And then to make a really interesting mix of the shaders, we can add in that slope map to mix in with the noise texture. So let's add in an attribute node, plug the color into the factor, and before we do this we need to go over to weight paint mode, make sure our slope is selected, and then go over to vertex paint, and then in the paint menu go to vertex color from weight. And back into object mode, we can type in the slope, and it needs to match the name here. And now mix these two, and let's switch it from mix to add, and let's bump the contrast up here, and then just switch this attribute to slope lowercase, and now let's switch the name here to a lowercase slope. And now that's brought in our weight map. We could bump up the contrast a little. And now with those two textures mixed in, we can plug in the result to our factor of the mix shader and view this one again. And so now we have a natural looking mixture of those two ground textures. Now with our hill textured, we can now add weight maps to add in particle systems for grass and trees. Go back to viewport shading and go to weight paint, and let's create a new vertex group, and let's label it grass and make another one for trees. And with the grass selected, we can go back to our reference image and see where most of the grass is. So it's up mostly on this hill, and then in between this hill and on top. That will do good for our grass weight map, and now let's see the reference for our trees. So the trees are just at the top and in the back here, and we can maybe add some in the foreground here too. So now let's make sure we switch to our tree map. And again, just go and find free tree models. Don't feel like you have to model a tree from scratch unless you want to, because that's good modeling practice and good texturing practice too. But for this tutorial, I'll be using some trees that I get off of BlenderKit. And then we'll do the same thing like with the grass collection and compile a few different types of pine trees and forest trees and then throw them into our particle system. So I just grabbed a few different pine tree models that I found on BlenderKit, and I'm just going to throw it into a collection for the particle system to reference. Now let's make the particle system for our trees. Create a new particle system, label it trees, label the particle system too. Make it a hair system, advanced, check the rotation, switch the render as a collection and have it reference our tree collection. And then in the density, have it reference our tree's weight map. And have the rotation be the object's Y. Let's make the scale a little bigger so we can start seeing our trees. And for the tree system, let's add in some children and interpolated so we get more coverage over our mountain. Maybe bring the scale up a little more. Now we have the trees and grass set on our midground. Now let's create our lone peak in the middle and finish up this scene. So all that's left to do is create this lone peak here in the middle and get a sky background image. And after that, then we can start animating the camera and get to rendering. So again, let's make sure we stay organized and let's create a background folder. And with that selected, we can hide. First, let's hide our particle systems so that way our computer doesn't slow down so much. And we can properly name this one too. Then let's hide that grass. And then let's go back into our A.N.T landscape and add in our mountain. First two, let's hide our other landscape pieces so we can just focus on the mountain piece. And for this one, we can go ahead and use the mountain preset. And let's change the mesh size to a 6x3. So for my lone mountain, I ended up with the mountain 1 preset, increased the subdivisions to 256. Mesh size is a 6x3. My random seed is 13. I increased the noise size to 1.56. And the height I set to 0.83. And I adjusted the fall off to be 4x3. We can still create our weight from slope in the Z direction, and that will be good for mixing textures on the mountain. Let's go back into object mode so we can scale it up and place it in our scene. Texture our mountain. Let's add a new material, and I'm going to be using another texture and shader that I found from Ambient CG. Let's load in our first rock texture. Now let's load in our second rock texture and get these mixed. Group it together and label it rock 2. And now we can mix the shaders. And then I increased the scale of the textures and played around with the mapping of the two rock textures for the mountain. Or similarly, like the lake floor texture, I used a noise texture to mix the two rock textures. Once your mountain shader is done, we need to add in a sky image, and you can use any high quality sky image that you think would fit for your scene. I purchased Kaiser Bold sky images, and that's what I'm using in this scene today. When you have your image loaded in, just increase the size, push it all the way back to the end of your scene, and rotate it on the X towards the camera to give more perspective to your scene. Now we can animate our camera. And for when I'm rotating the camera itself, I insert keyframes for the camera. And then when I'm moving the camera through the scene, I use keyframes on the empty that we parented to the camera. This provides a smoother sweeping motion like you would in a movie. And lastly, we want to animate the water of our lake. So go back to the shader for our lake water. And on the W of the noise texture, animate it from 0 to 0.001. And I'm using 250 frames for this animation. And you can render it out as is, but I'm going to be breaking up my scene and rendering out in sections by foreground, midground, and background, and then sky. Maybe in the future I will do a video on compositing and how to make render and how to edit renders a little more. But for now, I'm going to speed up the process and show you that I'm breaking down my scene. Now with our scene all broken down, we can render it out. Now that's a beautiful mountain lake scene, and congratulations on making your first environment design. That's huge and you should celebrate that. That's a big milestone. So I hope you learned a lot about environment design and how to think about it, and that environment design can actually be simpler if you just break it down into sections and workflow one step at a time. Instead of thinking you have to create this whole ginormous world within Blender. Make sure you like and subscribe down below and comment any ideas that you have for future videos or future tutorials or things you'd like to see me create or teach you how to create. So until next time, stay safe and stay creative out there. Peace.